That was a newspaper called the North Side News, or something like that. It was in 1950, and the North Side, Fort Worth North Side community decided they needed a facelift and for it to look Old West, because that's, everybody thought of Fort Worth West, they thought anything Western, they thought of North Fort Worth. That's where the stockyards were. That's where the North Side arena was, all the stockyard offices, all the saddle shops mainly. At that time, I think all of the saddle shops was on the north side, around the Exchange Avenue and North Main, where they crossed there. But back to me working in White's. Like I was saying, there was all of the saddle makers, very few of them stamped, very few of the stamp pens made saddles. So therefore they worked together and to make a saddle, a complete saddle. It was a lot of fun working at White's. There was also always something going on. Lewis White was pretty good at pulling jokes, and had a man downstairs working on, all he did was repair saddles. And he was real jumpy. You could just point your finger at him and he'd jump, and he was real goosey. And the saddle shop was upstairs, and the boot shop was, well, part of the boot shop was also upstairs, but then downstairs was nothing but boots and the office. And along one side of the room, this was a long, narrow room, and nothing but bootmakers working at a little bench along the wall. And on the other side, there were the machines, the finishers, the stitchers, things like that. But right behind the bootmakers, all the way down the line, behind them was a walkway about 3 or 4 foot, about 4 foot wide. And right at the end of that walkway was this man working on repairing saddles. And Lewis had a lot of fun aggravating this man. I'm not even sure they still have them now, but they had, back then they had a piece of fireworks that was about 5 inches long, maybe 5/8 or 3/4 of an inch in diameter. It was red, and you lit a fuse on, you laid it down on the ground and you lit a fuse, and it would just propel itself all over the place, and a whistling real loud, and when it got ready to quit, it would have a boom, a small firecracker in it. And Lewis would get a hold of them and get down on the floor and line this thing up. And they said he would spend some time lining it up, making sure it was going to go right down that alleyway towards that man that was real jumping. And he would light that thing and away it would go. And they said that just quick as that thing started whistling, this guy would start trying to climb up on his bench, and said it just run him batty. And I don't know why he put up with it and kept working, but he did, and I don't know. Lewis kept doing it. they was always pulling something. Vic was the one that kind of took care of the saddle department, and I'd worked there a while, so I told him that I wanted to build a saddle. And he said, okay. So he gave me an order to build. Well, it was no padded seat, rough out, roper, low cantle. And I started it and was doing pretty good. And there was another saddle maker there named Horace. And I'm not sure what his last name was. I'm not sure I even ever knew it. But he was between, I was in my 20s at that time, and he was probably in his 30s. And so I got to the point where I was having trouble getting the seat to lay down in where it's supposed to, the leather, down into the seat and stay in. And so I asked him about it and what the best thing to do. He said, oh, that's easy. So he walked over to his bench and got a couple of big old 3/4 inch black tacks. And he come over there and pushed it down where it was supposed to be. And he said, put a tack right there and right there. So I did. He said, now leave that overnight and let it dry. Well, I come back the next morning, and there was a spot about a 1/2 inch across around each one of those tacks that was black. And so I pulled them out, got my piece of sandpaper, and tried my best to get that black off, and it had never come off. And I don't know, I never did say anything to him. He never said anything. I finally turned the saddle in, and Vic, he looked at it, and he never said anything. But he never let me make another saddle. Horace was pulling something on me. He knew what it would do, but he didn't want me to build saddles. And most saddle makers back then, not all of them, but most of them, they were real protective of their art, of their craft. They didn't want to teach you anything because they didn't want you to learn. They wanted to be they didn't want it to spread that much. They was afraid they'd take their job away from them. There was a man that did all the fancy work, the fancy inlay of the boots. He worked upstairs with us. And when I first saw him, first time I was even around White's, well, I guess somebody was showing me around when I went to work there. And I saw him and saw his hands, and I said to myself then, man, if that's what I look like when I'm in these, I don't want no part of this, because all of his fingers, his thumb and these two fingers were bent, at this joint, were bent back 90 degrees. And that's just the way they stayed all the time. They wasn't where he could push them. That's the way they stayed. And it was from a lifetime of pushing down on them knives, cutting that stuff, because he had been doing this since he started out just a young boy, very young. I'm going to say before he's 10 years old, he was probably working at this in Mexico. But he was really good. Man, he did beautiful work. He did all of the inlay work on the old white boots. Beautiful work. He could make several layers where it would look, you know, he put different colors in each layer, and it really looked beautiful. He was good. He was a very good craftsman, very good artist. The lady that stitched all the tops, what was her name? Well, anyway, she was very good. I mean, she could just, all those real intricate designs on boot tops. I mean, just real intricate back and forth, leaves. She could just make that sewing machine sing when she was doing that. She just never stopped, seemed like. Hit the end of a stitch, and before you could even tell the machine slowed down, she was going again. Oh, Hazel. No, not Hazel. Anyway, a lady, a reporter, come in, and she was fascinated with this. So she went to the Whites and wanted to know if she could do an article on her. And they said, well, okay. So she did. She spent some time in there with, and then spent some time at home with her, talking to her and getting her story, a life story. And so she run 2 or 3 articles in the Star Telegram there in Fort Worth about her. And did it, from what I understand, I never did see it, but from what I understand, did a real good job. But in the process, she built her up and made her think that the Whites weren't paying her near enough for her ability. And so she built her up enough that she decided that she had to have a raise. Well, bootmaking is not a real, you don't make a lot of money building boots. And so the Whites were, they did pay a fair price on, as far as I know, to all of their laborers. They were good at paying a fair price. And so she went to them and told them, says, I've got to have a raise. And she said, I got to have so-and-so. And they told her, said, we can't do it. We just cannot pay that much. And she said, okay, I quit. So she went home. And I don't know, some time rocked on, and the Whites had one of the other people in the shop could do tops, but not near as fast as she was, and not quite as good. So they kept getting behind and further behind. So Lewis went out to her house and talked to her. And well, she'd been out of work for 2 weeks, and she didn't, have very much money. So she was beginning to hurt financially. And so Lewis gave her a little bit of a raise just to get her to come back, and she felt like, well, they're giving me a raise, so that's okay. So she was saving face a little bit, and so she went back. And she was still stitching tops years later when I bought out the shop. And she worked for me for a while. But she was really good, really good. There was a Mr. Ford there, and he was the one that interpreted the measurements that whoever was taking the boot order took the measurements of the customer's feet. He put it down on an order card and brought it to Mr. Ford, and Mr. Ford was the one that translated that into patterns to cut the leather by. And then somebody else took that and cut the leather and started the process of building the boots. I never saw either one of Vic's or Lewis's wives around the shop all the time I was there. I just assumed that they didn't have any interest in the business, or Lewis and Vic didn't have any interest in them helping. Vic is the one that did most of the paperwork. He was in the office. Before I knew him, there was a big hardware store next to their saddle shop and boot shop, and they owned that building. And the hardware business folded, and so they knocked a hole in the wall and made a big door, and so they opened a Western store in that part of the building. And when I first was in there, that had already happened. And so I don't remember anything about a hardware store being there. There was a lot of history concerning them and Fort Worth. They were the oldest boot shop in Fort Worth. There were older saddle shops, but no older boot shops. Later, Letty Brothers come in